Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus, powered by the Center Square and a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Christen Smith, Pennsylvania editor at the Center Square Newswire service. To support fine podcasts like this one, please donate. You can click the link in the show description, and you can find all of the Center Square's great podcasts at americastalking.com. You can also link to the Center Square podcast through the podcast drop-down menu at thecentersquare.com. We are recording on Thursday, February 9th, 2023. Joining me today, as always, is Anthony Hennen, our Pennsylvania reporter based in Philadelphia. Welcome back to the podcast, Anthony.
Hey, Christen. How you doing?
Good. Can't wait to dive right into our one and only story this week, appropriately named The Sport of Kings, which for the uninitiated like myself is all about horse racing. Anthony did a really long, deep dive into the $3.5 billion worth of subsidies that Pennsylvania taxpayers have sent to the industry since 2004. That decision from lawmakers came with a lot of big promises about what that investment would bring us. And so it's been about 19 years, and we have 6 horse tracks since then. But it seems like now is a good time as any to look into what we've received, if anything, from these subsidies. So Anthony, why don't you take us away? Tell us, put this into a little bit more context for us. I mean, you hear $3.5 billion, and in your mind, you know that's huge. But what does that look like on a contextual level based on the other things that taxpayers subsidize?
Yeah, so when we're looking at these sort of statewide subsidy programs, this is actually the largest one Pennsylvania has. When you add up separate programs, something on economic development or something might come out a little more just because there's kind of so many of those different things going into it. But when we're looking at specific programs, the subsidy that Pennsylvania actually sends to the Horse Racing Development Fund is the biggest statewide. It varies from year to year, but I believe last year was about $230 million, if I'm remembering correctly. Generally, it's somewhere between $200 and $250 million or so. So basically, this came about as a compromise of sorts to expand casino gambling statewide. Essentially, this money comes out of a 55% tax levied on the revenue from slot machine gaming. There's a few ways this 55% gets cut up. Goes for property tax relief, goes toward counties and municipalities that have casinos, that sort of thing. But horse racing gets basically a huge subsidy as a result of getting horse owners buy-in, because previously, before 2004, horse racing was the only legalized form of gambling in the Commonwealth. So the compromise to expand it into casinos not necessarily connected to horse racing was to make sure that you had some revenue going to this. This adds up a lot. It's a lot of money, and it's also a lot of money going to an industry that isn't really that popular anymore. Horse racing broadly has sort of been declining since the 1940s, 1950s in the popular imagination. People are more interested in, traditional table games or slot machines, sports gambling. They're not really making out to horse racing that much. And when you look at attendance figures, you're actually, you're getting more people showing up on average for minor league baseball games across the state, whether it's in the Lehigh Valley, over in Harrisburg, or out in Williamsport. All those basically get double, if not triple or more, the attendance size that racetracks do. So basically, this is a lot of money going into an industry that doesn't really have much public support behind it, but it's essentially a way to expand gambling, and that was a deal that was worked out on the political side.
In your story, you hit on something really interesting to me. There was a quote that something to the effect of Pennsylvania cares more about horses than it does students in our college students in our state system of higher education. Can you talk to me a little bit more about the spending there versus the spending per horse versus per student?
Yeah, so this was sort of dug up by Sharon Ward, who did a report for Education Voters of Pennsylvania a few years ago. I believe that came out about the spring of 2020. But basically, when you actually look at the funding of how this gets split up and how many horses there are compared to money going into PASI, the state's public university system, horses are coming out ahead. When you actually break it down, Pennsylvania pays out about $15,000 per horse. Compared to students, though, they pay out about $5,700 per student. So horses are getting not quite 3 times as much as college students are in terms of state subsidies, but it's a big jump. It's a very big jump coming essentially from this funding rolling in from legalized gambling.
So that I find that statistic just mind-boggling to me, especially considering, not to get too far flung of our story here, but considering the funding challenges that the state system of higher education has had over the last 10 years, the declining enrollment, and, how PASHI has kind of come to the state legislature every year for the last few years with hat in hand, asking for help. I mean, they've made huge efforts to redesign their system to cut costs, to reduce staff. They even combined several universities in the East and West to kind of consolidate their operations so that they could serve the same amount of students, but not be spread out over so many. Well, I might be misconstruing that. They reorganized to save costs somewhat and to be more efficient. And it was a very expensive plan. And to hear that, they're spending per horse so much more per student, it is eye-opening. Now, I'm sure that you could dive deeper into that about why, and you will hear. But one of the things that you touched on in the story as well that I found interesting is that 90% of, clarify for me, 90% of, or some of this money funds, or a lot of this money funds winnings for gamblers.
Yeah. So essentially the idea here is, horse racing, the idea of the higher quality you can get is dependent essentially on the purse, the prize money at hand. So if you can offer bigger purses, you can get more, higher quality horse breeders coming in, people from other states to race in your races. That's kind of what attracts people to the Kentucky Derby, the Belmont Stakes, these kind of bigger races you see across the country. So when you look at it, before 2004 and before these subsidies started coming in, the purses were based on wagers. That would be the money flowing in, and then that could determine, how much money is being won. But then now when you look at it, the subsidies basically account for about 90% of purses in Pennsylvania horse races. We've seen wagers kind of hold steady, drop a little bit. Because even when you look at these racetracks with horse racing, even the majority of the money is not coming from horse racing. Most of it is coming from the attached casinos for slots, for table games, et cetera, et cetera. It's more appropriate to think of, a casino with horse racing attached to it rather than horse racing driving people to these specific casinos. You could almost think of it as, a blockbuster with, a casino attached to it because we have some high value in keeping a blockbuster alive. But yeah, a lot of this money is not necessarily coming from the horse racing industry itself or being generated that way. A lot of this is coming in from other forms of gambling, keeping it alive, even though, Pennsylvanians are not really interested in horse racing anymore. When you look at a lot of these wagers being made on horse racing, a lot of it is coming from out of state, from these horse races being broadcast at tracks in other states, et cetera, et cetera. But there's not a lot of public support behind it, simply because the public is taking interest in other areas. Younger generations especially are not really that attracted to horse racing. This is a lot of money going to subsidize a very small number of horse breeders, owners, that sort of thing.
So essentially what you're saying is the horse racing industry seems to be piggybacking on the growth of casinos and, other table games and gambling that we've seen in Pennsylvania in the last several years.
Yeah, that was basically the buy-in to get them to support expanding gambling in the first place. Because before then, they had there are no other options except, go to the horse races or find a black market bookie. But this was kind of getting the industry to buy into it.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's become something where these subsidies are expected, and the representatives for horse breeders, horse owners would actually like to see those subsidies expand, or at least be held steady. In case they see some sorts of declines, they want to make sure there's at least a no harm done level that they get.
This sounds like a big ask from lawmakers, but considering they've been spending billions over the last 20 years, it maybe they'll get it. But I know we can't read the tea leaves on that necessarily. What I'm curious to know, though, because you spoke to a lot of people about this story, where do we see the most benefits from this? I mean, we've talked a lot about we pour money into this, and it doesn't seem like Pennsylvanians are actually interested in horse racing. So can you talk a little bit more about what supporters of the industry say is the most important outcome of this spending?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, they argue that this is part of keeping the equine industry in general alive in the state. They point to some studies done out of the Department of Agriculture, basically categorizing the horse industry as the second largest agricultural industry in Pennsylvania. They point to some direct and indirect jobs, where if you want to believe their numbers or not, I'll leave that to your take on economic impact studies and how accurate they are. But I mean, they talk about things of horse farms keep a lot of open space that stays in agriculture rather than elsewhere. They talk about, without the equine industry, there could be over 1 million acres subject to development, which was said by Pete Peterson, who represents the Pennsylvania Equine Coalition. Essentially, it's this idea that this is a crucial part of agriculture in general. However, when you do, granted, the equine industry is big in Pennsylvania. The horse racing industry, though, as a part of the equine industry, is not so big. When you're looking at why people own horses or what they do with it, it's generally people owning it for recreational purposes, for hunting, for pleasure riding, dressage, which is fancy horse dancing, I suppose you could call it, depending on how aristocratic or how populous you want to be. Horse racing is not the only part of the horse industry. And I think, when you look at the report coming from the Education Voters of Pennsylvania on these subsidies, we're looking at about 47 farms for standardbred stallions and 26 farms for thoroughbreds. And granted, horses do have large demands on things like setting the price of hay, because they kind of go for higher quality hay than some other agricultural industries. But I think we can kind of get lost in the weeds here when we're talking about specific industries, or why subsidies for X is crucial or why subsidies for Y is crucial. You see a lot of different industries make these claims. Some of them may be stronger than others. But change is inherent in life and in the Pennsylvania economy, and we start hitting some point where there's diminishing returns to making sure that no industry declines, or that we dedicate funding to one specific thing in perpetuity. It may have been. I understand the level of a political compromise to get support for expanding gambling in the early 2000s, but I think it's a fair question to ask after almost 20 years, after $3.5 billion in taxpayer money. Should we really be doing this forever? Does the average Pennsylvanian really have a strong investment in keeping this industry alive, or keeping the money going to horse racing rather than something like education, infrastructure upgrades, even just like property tax relief? There's a lot of competing needs across the state, and when you look at the people who raise horses or compete in horse racing, this is not exactly a representative family in Pennsylvania. I mean, they generally tend to be well off. It generally tends to be a hobby rather than anything else.
You're right about the entanglement of so many of these different subsidies, and how they touch so many different parts of our economy, and it makes it hard to parse out which ones can go and which ones can stay. Now, I think a lot of your research here and conversations seem to point out a lot of issues and shortcomings with this Racehorse Development Fund. And you're right. The money that we spend every year on this, one can't help but wonder what better thing we could put that towards. You mentioned infrastructure. Pennsylvania notoriously has some of the worst roads and bridges in the state. And fun fact, we have the second most bridges in the entire country, which, considering we're landlocked, is interesting to me. However, our inability to properly fund our roads and fix our bridges and keep on top of our infrastructure needs has been, a perennial problem in Pennsylvania. And we've talked about, raising taxes, doing, tolls, all kinds of things that would have increased the taxpayer burden to fix this problem. And so it makes you wonder, is there room to take that money and to spend it elsewhere, such as roads and bridges, such as higher education? There's many things. Maybe just give it directly to the agriculture industry instead of trying to funnel it through this, dying sport, as you said. I can't imagine how people would react to your story after reading it and to understanding that this is where their money is going. But that's exactly what the Center Square is here for. It's to let people know this is what you are funding. This is where your money is going. And so your mileage may vary as far as what you're comfortable with. So that's about all the time. Oh, continue.
Yeah, I was just going to add some more context for it. When we're looking at this money, the federal government is sending about $170 million over the next 5 years to come in for building out electric vehicle charging stations. When you're looking at the money that we're sending to Pennsylvania, Tennessee's airports are asking the state legislature for about $125 million. So it's, horse racing is getting almost twice as much as airports do in some other states. I think after a certain point, especially when you're looking at a state like Pennsylvania, which has an aging population, we're seeing more. We're seeing more expected spending to come in the next few years for taking care of the aging population, of trying to deal with higher housing costs across the Commonwealth. I think it really lawmakers need to take these trade-offs seriously. Of how much is too much, or are we going to fund these things permanently going forward? There's some rural issues versus urban issues, things like that. But I think a lot of this comes down to, I don't think the state can afford to keep everything the same in perpetuity, especially as we're looking at, economic struggles, at population issues. I don't think the public really realizes that when you're looking at these subsidies, horse racing is one of the leading ones across the state.
Well said, and thank you for looking deep into that. It's something that I think it gets cast aside for all the many, many issues facing Pennsylvanians. So thank you, Anthony, for doing that and for talking with me this week. We encourage you to find news that matters for taxpayers of Pennsylvania at thecentersquare.com. To support fine podcasts like this one, please donate. You can click the link in the show description. This has been the Pennsylvania in Focus podcast, part of America's Talking Network. Find all of the Center Square's podcasts at americastalking.com. I'm Christen Smith, and I'll be back next week with Anthony Hennen to discuss the biggest stories affecting you, the taxpayers.